Good evening, everybody. Appreciate y'all joining tonight for our second spring webinar, Elusive and Consequential, Mastering Nitrogen Demand and Availability. I'm Jackson Stansel. I'm the founder and CEO of Sentinel Fertigation. I'm glad to see some of you from our first webinar and then some new names as well. And excited to talk about nitrogen management tonight. Bob Gunzenhauser, who's our Director of Agronomy, is going to be leading our webinar tonight. He has a long career in agriculture and in ag tech, and has seen a lot of different things with nitrogen management over the course of his career, and he'll be sharing some of that wisdom with you tonight. He'll give a little bit more of a thorough introduction of himself before diving into all the details of tonight's presentation. And with that, Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, thank you very much, Jackson. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your evening tonight to share with us, to be a part of this presentation. Hope to interact with you as well after the presentation and take your questions. There's a lot to learn in nitrogen management. We don't know all the answers. I'm going to just hit a lot of the topics tonight, a lot of the high points, but hopefully it can spur on some great conversations, some thoughts as well. Jackson, if you go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce, give you guys a little background about who I am. I am the Director of Agronomy. I've been on board of Sentinel since the first of the year. Prior to that, I was with Corteva AgriScience for a little over 16 years. In total, about almost 30 years of precision ag and production ag experience. I was with Corteva there for a number of years with many different agronomy and digital insights and innovations called fit mapping, Field 360, Encirca, and granular agronomy. Most recently with that, working on a nitrogen management tool that we had there at Corteva that covered a lot of acres and got a lot of experience from that. I also have 15 years plus of farming experience. I am from South Central Iowa, grew up in that area, fifth generation farming in that area. I also, and so when I was in the farming business, worked on, grew corn, soybeans, and also had some hay as well. Also had some experience in ag biz, had my own feed, seed, and precision ag business for a number of years. Also just now also working with agronomy consulting services. So I also have 4 patents in my background there, and as well as numerous publications in various journals. Like I mentioned, I'm from South Central Iowa. Live on our family farm, my wife and 3 kids. I have 2 in college, 1 still at home in high school. And we have a number of chickens and boar goats. And so if you follow me on Twitter or X as it's called today, you'll probably see some interesting insights around nitrogen management, but you'll also probably see some chickens and goats. Also, one thing to mention too is I'm an Iowa State grad, so sometimes that's good or bad depending on the crowd, but proud to be a Cyclone as well. All right, let's jump into what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm just going to kind of start off with some high level things. Some of these techniques or terms that you may hear here are some of the things you've already heard. Maybe you've already got names to them, maybe you don't. And so I want to just level set with everyone on the basics of nitrogen in the soil. So the forms of nitrogen, crop uptake timing, the influence that water has. I don't think we can discount that at all. And then also transformation and loss pathways of nitrogen. How does nitrogen convert in the soil? How does it transform? Where does it go if we have lost opportunities? I'm also going to touch on manure, cover crops, stabilizers, and biologicals. These are all things that affect how we handle nitrogen in the soil. They add nitrogen to the soil. They help us provide nitrogen. So they interact with these things. And there's a lot of things that are management considerations that farmers think about. And we want to be able to touch on those topics as well. And then finally, I want to just wrap it up with some best strategies for nitrogen management. What steps to take and consider. Now, I've given this type of presentation before to a local group of farmers here in South Central Iowa, and so I really dove deep into what we could do here. Now, I know I'm talking to a regional, if not national, perhaps international audience, so I can't tell you exactly how to manage nitrogen in your area, but I'm going to ask a few questions and give you a few ideas on how you can start that journey on your own to start understanding what works best in your area if you still haven't figured that out. Well, let's jump right into it then. One of the things that makes nitrogen so elusive and consequential is that many of the dynamics we have within nitrogen management are out of our control. That's what makes it really difficult, right? We have the weather as our number one issue to deal with nitrogen management. We put nitrogen in the ground, we give nitrogen fertilizer to our crops, then the weather happens. And so what happens to that nitrogen that we applied there? Does it leach out? Does it denitrify? Does it get taken up by the plants or not? We have a lot of variability with the weather that makes it so difficult to manage. Likewise, the interaction with the weather with our soils. We may have one soil type in a field. May have multiple soil types in a field. We may have different fields with different soil conditions. And so those all have different interactions with that weather. So when we make an application, when we put the nitrogen in the ground, we may have one field behave differently than another because of the soils that we have there, even if the weather may be the same between the two fields. And finally, prices, right? Nitrogen is a market-driven product. And it is driven by demand. It is driven by the availability of natural gas. Uh, Tariffs, trade issues can also affect that. Of course, our crop prices are affected too by all those things as well. And so the pricing of both the cost of the fertilizer, but also the price that we receive for our crops, all come into play into our thought process. How much nitrogen do I need to apply? So we understand these are all things that are kind of out of our control. But if we understand the underlying dynamics, the things that could cause us to lose nitrogen, things that cause nitrogen to become more available, then we could start to plan ahead a little bit better and be able to react properly or plan for properly when we get the terrible weather events, we get that extra rain, we get the dry spell, we have low prices for commodities, we have high prices of nitrogen. What do we need to do there? If we understand the basic dynamics, we can be prepared to handle them much better. Let's jump into the next slide here. This is some made-up data. I'll just say out front, but it would be as if I went out to your field. You gave me about 5 acres or so, and I set up a small plot. And I went out there and applied nitrogen from 0 to 300 pounds. And I had 3 replications, and I got the yield data back, and I calculated, figured out what the nitrogen cost was, what the market price of your corn was, and I plotted all that out, right? So I just calculate the economic response to nitrogen rate across the x-axis on the bottom, and then what was the economic value on the y-axis. So let's say I do that. We set that little plot, some part on your farm, and we've got that calculated out. The place where that curve is at its most highest, it's at the apex, is the economic optimum nitrogen rate. That is the optimum rate where we are making the most money possible, given the yield that we get, given the cost of nitrogen, how much nitrogen we apply. And so there's always going to be some noise in that. You see with those dots, those red dots indicate each one of the replications we had out there. And so sometimes I talk about, the fact that we may say, yes, there is absolutely one point that rate that maxed out our economic optimum or value there, but there's sometimes on the side of its shoulders because we have noisy data to make that nice straight curve. I often talk about could we, like back off $5 either way on that curve because we have that noise. It's kind of a confidence or confidence interval there, and sometimes that range might be 20, 30 pounds on either side. It's like you give up some yield, but you save some money in nitrogen, or you make more yield, but you give up more cost of that nitrogen as well. So there's some shoulders to that economic optimum nitrogen rate. And this is like as if we just tried this one time in your field, one part of your field. If I took this and went to another part of your field, you might have a different EONR. If we're at that same location, but we had a different year, it may also be different as well. And so that's what makes it really elusive and difficult is, yes, we might be able to figure out that EONR 1 year for that one situation, but it may change from year to year. Now, it may not be too far off, and it may be somewhere within those bounds that we have every year, but sometimes they're not. And that's what makes it really challenging to deal with. Going on the next slide, and I'm not going to pick on on Iowa State too much, but we have, and they've actually done some great work here with some guidance developed called infact.ag. So if you go to that website, it's a great tool based upon a lot of modeling that that team has done, also backed up by a lot of on-farm research. And there's a way you can go through that website and select, the county that you're in, your corn on corn or corn on soybeans, and allows you to pick some other factors like, the weather, the precipitation, is average or above normal or below normal for the spring and the summer, planting date, things like that. And so I plugged in, the 4 counties that, is right where I'm at in South Central Iowa. I'm in Wayne County, at the bottom, kind of straight south central part of the state. And what it told me when I plugged in my parameters for my county, it didn't ask me the soil type, just said, here's for the county, here's what we simulate. it said my economic optimum nitrogen rate, that median value is 220 pounds of nitrogen per acre for those parameters I plugged in there, right? But it can range from 128 to 320 based upon their modeling, based upon the weather we've had and the soils that we have in the county. Now, if I go just north, closer to Des Moines, in Lucas County, that median value is 232 pounds, but 135 to 328. But if I go one county to the west, in Decatur County, I'm at 260. So I jump from 220 to 260, 40 pounds difference by just moving 4 miles over. Now, this is not, again, to put down Iowa State. They've done great work, but it also does illustrate that even the best efforts that we have today show there's a lot of variability out there when it comes to determining that economic optimum nitrogen rate. There's a lot of factors that play into it, primarily the weather, maybe more so in some places than others, especially where I'm at, but also then the soils that we may have and that interaction with the weather, and also our price of nitrogen, our market price of our crops. So let's jump into, first of all, let's kind of go back to basics and talk about the forms of nitrogen, right? So we split into two different forms, inorganic and organic nitrogen. It's important to talk about these two different forms because inorganic is pretty much what's crop available, and organic is not plant available, although it is organic. You think that, the plant's organic, crop's organic, soil's organic, I should be able to take it up. But the way it works is the inorganic nitrogen is what's plant available. And that comes in two different forms, primarily that can be taken by the plant. That's going to be in the ammonium form, the NH4 positive charge. What's nice about ammonium is that it fixes to the soil. It fixes its exchange sites and becomes a little tighter to the soil, doesn't move as much, for a time at least. Nitrate, on the other hand, is a negative nitrate, NO3. That's a negative charge. It's an anion, and it can be loose in the soil water solution. Now, both of those are readily taken by the plant, but one is fixed in the soil, one can be moved around the water. We can't go without talking about urea. Urea is also an inorganic nitrogen form, but it's not plant available. But when it gets in the soil, it converts to the NH4, the positive charge. On the organic nitrogen side, as I mentioned, it's not plant available. It's tied up in part of the carbon components. You're going to find that, of course, in the soil, the humus, the organic matter there, plant residue, manure, cover crops, they're all going to have organic nitrogen in them. And when they will become plant available through mineralization, and when they convert, they convert first to the NH4, the ammonium charged ion. Now go to the next slide. It gives us a breakdown of a lot of the commercial fertilizers that we know and love. So anhydrous ammonia, very popular here in Iowa. It's 82% nitrogen, but 100% of that nitrogen is NH4 positive charge. Put together products like urea ammonium nitrate, UAN, or liquid 28, 32%. That's a split between ammonium between ammonia and nitrate at 25% each, and the rest of it's urea. As you can see, there's other breakdowns of urea, ammonium nitrate, and some of those other products that have others like the phosphorus and the sulfurs with it as well. But you see a lot of these products do contain either ammonium or products that will convert to ammonium with urea. The one exception being the ammonium nitrate. That's 50-50 ammonium and nitrate there. And I think that's partially due to the fact that we like to apply nitrogen maybe ahead of when the crop needs it sometimes. And we want to be able to stick in the soil. Again, the ammonium has that function, will stay in the soil a little bit longer and be preserved there. Going on to the next slide, I want to talk about, when does corn need nitrogen? Yeah. We often talk about when is it ready to go put on nitrogen, when is it fit. Just here in southern Iowa, the last 2-3 days, it just got fitted up, and a lot of anhydrous tanks started flying out the door. A lot of anhydrous went on in the last 2 or 3 days. Is it the right time? Is there a crop to grow that's going to take it up? No, it's going to be a couple, 3 months at least. If we look at the chart over here on the left-hand side, this is from Iowa State. It tells us when does corn typically take up its nitrogen. So starting on the left-hand side, you see at emergence, it's not taking up very much nitrogen at all. In fact, it doesn't really do much until about V6. So about 6% of nitrogen is taken up by V6. And that's, give or take when the corn is planted in the Midwest, that's going to be approximately, the first week of June, give or take. Then after that, in June and into first part of July, we are on a tear. This crop is taking up a lot of nitrogen very quickly through that V6 to VT time period, and it's primarily put into the leaf blades. It's building out its solar radiation collection system. So it's putting that into that, building out the stalks and leaf sheaths as well. And then when it gets to VT, that tassel, it starts to convert over and build out the shanks and husks and cob. And then shortly after, about R2, R3, R2 initially, it's starting to put nitrogen into the grain fill. So on the left-hand chart, or the right-hand chart, shows us that about 63% of the total nitrogen taken up by the plant is taken up by flowering. So a good almost 2/3 of the nitrogen is taken up by flowering. So it's very critical, of course, for that nitrogen to be in the soil during that time period. You've got to build out that soil collection system. 37%, however, is taken up after flowering. And of that, about 62% of that 37 is taken up from the soil, but 38% of it, give or take, is remobilized from the plant. The plant actually removes it from the leaf, from the shoot, the stalk, and remobilizes it into the grain fill. As you guys know, as you grow out corn, it's going to die reproducing, trying to reproduce as best as possible. And it's going to kill itself to do so. And so some of that nitrogen that's already been taken in the leaves and the shoots will be taken and converted over into the grain fill to get it out there. Now that's important to know. When does nitrogen need to be there? It's at V6 to VT period. V9 is when it really hits its stride, really starts going off there, but V6 is the initiation of that. Going on to the next slide, I want to take a little detour and talk about soil water dynamics, because the next things we talk about after this are going to be super important and they do relate to water. So I want to first talk about soil water holding capacity. How much water can the soil hold? How much can it make available to the plant? Because that's going to affect how much the crop, how well the crop can grow. If there's not enough water in the soil, if it's sandy or dry, it's not going to take up much nitrogen. But if we have enough water holding capacity, it certainly will. And so, the water holding capacity is primarily driven by both the texture of the soil, that is, the sand, silt, and clay content of the soil, and also organic matter. The greater the organic matter, typically the more water it can hold there. And I want to talk about three important points of how we calculate, how we utilize, estimate water holding capacity. So wilting point, field capacity, and saturation are three terms. They are basically percentages of the total volume of the soil that indicate different water levels. So wilting point is at the bottom end, depending again on that texture and the organic matter. It's the amount of water that can be in the soil that it's basically when the plant can pull out no more of that water. It can't extract anymore. There's still some water existing in the soil, but the plant physically just cannot create enough suction to pull that off out of the soil. Going to the next one, field capacity, it's kind of like the Goldilocks level of soil moisture. It's not too wet, not too dry. It's kind of moist. It's got some air in it though, and it's just about the perfect conditions for soil growth, for plant growth. I mean, there's a little bit of water still surrounding every soil particle, but it has air in between. Like I said, it's moist, but it's not dripping out. And at the top end of soil water conditions is saturation. And that's when the soil is completely filled with water. There's no air. There's no gaps in it. The water can flow through it gravitationally. That is, it just drips right through. If you were to hold it, it'd start dripping right out. And so some of you probably have experienced that with very wet springs. Some of you probably more experienced with the wilting point level of moisture content as well. But that gives you a full range there. And the way we look at available water holding capacity of the soil is we find out what is the difference between the field capacity moisture content and the wilting point content. Typically, silt loams are the best. They will have the most water holding capacity. Sands are a lot lower, but also some clays are quite low too. The more clay soils you get, even though it can hold more water at that wilting point, it's not all extractable, not all available. So again, field loams and silt loams tend to be our best soils for water holding capacity. Going on to the next slide, another term I want to introduce you to, if you may be aware of, is saturated hydraulic conductivity. It's also called KSAT. That's just the parameter name for it. Excuse me, but it's a measure of how well does water move through that saturated soil, how fast it can go through that. And again, it's based upon the soil characteristics like the texture, the structure, the porosity, consistency. Infiltration rate's another term that we often use similar to this, not quite like it, but in the same vein. And I included a couple examples of different very, very contrasting soils that you can actually find in Nebraska. One is the Luton silty clay. It's found in the parts of the Platte River but also the Missouri River bottom as well. Very tight clay soil. Um, and when you figure out the KSAT there, water can move through that very tight clay soil at 0.01 inches per hour, almost nothing. Uh, so it's a very difficult soil to deal with for water. Usually a lot of people do a lot of surface drains with that. It's a tough one. On the opposite extreme is the Valentine fine sand. That's your Aeolian sand that you have out in the sand hills. That some of that is farmed as well, and it comes out about 13 inches an hour. So you have two very contrasting ones there as far as their KSAT. Now, this is important to know as we talk about some loss mechanisms like leaching and denitrification. So let's move to the next slide and get into the first one here, nitrification. So nitrification is a natural process. It is the conversion of ammonium to nitrate by bacteria. There's a couple of bacteria species that are noted for it, Nitrus amonis and Nitrobacter. They are driven primarily by three things: soil temperature, soil moisture, and soil pH. Those three factors drive how much nitrification occurs. Now, nitrification is a natural process. It's going to happen. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it does occur and it converts our ammonium fertilizer to nitrates, it does put the nitrogen at risk. Doesn't mean it's lost, doesn't mean it's gone, but it can, when it's in that nitrate form, there are different ways to lose it. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. But as I mentioned, soil temperature, moisture, and pH are the main factors for nitrification conversion. Go on to the next slide. Here's a little more insights into that. So the first graph on the left-hand side is how does soil water affect nitrification rates? And this comes from the DSAT crop model. This is based upon model data or measured data that has been built in the model. But the response is something like this. If you look at the values below, wilting point, field capacity, saturated, those are your water levels we just talked about. What it shows is that typically nitrification occurs at max rate when the soil is moist in that field capacity range. That's when nitrification will be at its utmost. That's when the bacteria is healthy. I got some air, I got some water, things are good. So bacteria is going to be happy in those conditions. Down at wilting points, about 50% as effective in nitrification. It's a linear function there. But as you also go the other direction towards saturation, the nitrification rate drops down. Again, the bacteria is not as happy. It's a little more saturated, a lot more water, not enough air, not enough respiration. Not going to do as much work there. Likewise, when we look at nitrification factors by soil temperature and pH, we see definitely a response there. So this chart has at the bottom the soil temperature is from 41 to 86 degrees. And you see there that around that 40-degree temperature, there's not a lot of activity. The percentage of nitrification on a daily basis is really fairly low. But as you move to warmer temperatures, the nitrification rate does increase. But also, pH plays a big factor in this. If I have a soil, my bottom green line is a 5.0 pH. It shows the least amount of nitrification even as you increase the soil temperature. But if you move to the top line, which is 7 pH, you see that's much greater. Now, this is not me telling you, hey, don't line your fields, keep it at 5.0 pH. I'm not telling you that at all to slow down nitrification. But I will tell you that if you do have higher pH soils, you'll typically probably have higher nitrification at those higher temperatures than if you would if you had lower pH. That's just something to consider. There are soils in Iowa that are naturally a 7.5 pH. There's also they also have an organic matter up to 6 to 8 percentage organic matter. They're in depressional areas, and they also have a lot of tile lines running through them for drainage, and so they're going to have a lot of nitrification, a lot of conversion, and unfortunately a lot of leaching, a lot of nitrogen loss through those tile lines just by the nature of the soils they have. So these are two main factors that really drive nitrification. But what happens when we have that nitrogen converted from ammonia to nitrate? Excuse me, and we get some heavy soaking soils or soaking rains. And let's say we're on closer to that Luton silty clay type soil, right? Or maybe we got a Luton type of soil down below, just below the surface. Well, we're going to have some denitrification. And that's a process that can happen when we have anaerobic conditions. That soil is saturated. There's a little air left in there or none at all. And there could be some ponding of water. And after a few days, the anaerobic bacteria kicks in. It says, hey, I've got my environment now. I've been waiting my whole life for this. it kicks in, starts going after that nitrate, converts, goes through about three different processes or so, one of which converts that nitrate to nitrous oxide, the N2O gas, which is a greenhouse gas. Eventually, it converts it to N2, just the atmospheric nitrogen. But either way, we've lost our nitrogen that we've put down, right? And that also occurs when we have higher soil temperatures. So if we're in that May, June time period and we get 4 to 6 inches of rain, and maybe we've already got a lot of rain already ahead of that, and we've got a lot of water just sitting there, you're going to see some fields looking like this, right? These yellow spots in the field. So not only are you going to have some nitrogen loss, you're probably also going to have some anoxic conditions. Plants don't like it. The corn doesn't like to have saturated conditions. It won't put down as well roots either. It doesn't like to grow in saturated conditions as well. So it's all around kind of a bad deal for both the nitrogen and the crop. But you go to the next slide. If we get those kind of big rains and you're on more of that Valentine fine sand, you're probably going to see this one, leaching. And that's your downward movement of nitrate in that water. Again, we're not going to see that so much with the ammonium, but if it's in the nitrate, definitely it's in that solution. And it can leach out and move out of the rooting zone. And that can be lost to tile lines and aquifers. And so that's not a great thing either, to lose nitrogen either this way, because it's, again, it's money that we spent, but also it's now causing some downstream issues as well. So going to the next slide, one other loss mechanism that we can run into is volatilization. Now, if we put all of our fertilizer, knife it in the ground or put it in the filter, we're probably not going to see much of that. But if anytime we're applying anything on the surface, volatilization could really be an issue. And so that's an example here with anything that contains ammonia or urea that can also convert to ammonia can also volatilize through hydrolysis. And so, if we're out there spreading a dry fertilizer on top, whether it's urea or ammonium nitrate or any of the other ammonium-containing products, we can have volatilization losses, especially when it's warmer and more moist conditions. Higher pH can also lead to that as well. And so this is some data I pulled from some research showing what happens, if we get a certain amount of rainfall within a certain number of days after application. And this is with no-till corn, nitrogen in Pennsylvania with urea. And it shows that, if we get 4/10 of an inch of rain within 2 days after application, we probably won't see any losses due to volatilization. But if it's, after about 3 days, one more day, it's been sitting out there, we may have about 10% losses. But also interesting is that it's actually worse if we get a little bit of rain, but not enough, like 1/10 to 2/10 of an inch. If it's just wet enough just to kind of, knock things down a little bit, that can cause some issue. And of course, if you have no rain for a while, then we have a lot of losses. And again, it really depends on that temperature, the pH of the soil that's in there, the crop residue, and also if we have a stabilizer or not. But we'll talk about that later. Okay. So this chart kind of talks about all those dynamics we just discussed. You have their nitrogen going into the ground. It could be in the form of urea, for example. We could have some loss due to volatilization. But let's say it gets worked in the ground, it becomes ammonium NH4 charge. Now that can be taken up by the plants, but that also can be nitrified and through nitrification turned into nitrate. And that nitrate can also be taken up by the plants, but it can be lost through denitrification and leaching. One thing I want to point about the ammonium ion in nitrification is that if you're doing a banded product like anhydrous ammonia, you actually do want to have some nitrification occur. It's not a bad thing because unless we plant our corn directly on the anhydrous knife marks, if it wasn't for nitrification, we wouldn't be able to access those hot bands of nitrogen until the roots got to them. But because we have nitrification occurring at some point, we will have that nitrification occur. That nitrate will get in the water solution, move over, get into the root zones, and get picked up by the plants. So that's important to have some nitrification. The problem is all the things that could occur when we have nitrification occur that develop the nitrates there. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And we want to talk about mineralization next. So this is, again, another natural process, bacteria driven as well. It's a conversion of any kind of nutrient from the organic form into a form that's available to the plant. It is driven by microbes. It's again driven by temperature, moisture, and pH. Very similar characteristics to nitrification. And so through that process, we do produce ammonia, that NH4 positive charge. But I also say caveat, because of the same conditions as nitrification, they'll probably get converted to nitrate in a pretty quick basis, depending on the situation there. The opposite function of mineralization is immobilization. So that's a situation where you'll add a product that has a lot of high C to N ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio, something that actually requires more nitrogen out of the soil for it to break down. And so this chart on the right-hand side describes some of that, depending on what type of residue we're talking about. Next bullet point is around previous crop credits. People like to say, well, with soybeans, is there a credit, 40 bushels or 40 pounds of nitrogen for 40 bushels an acre, give or take? And honestly, with a lot of the high yielding soybeans we've had today, 60, 70, 80 bushels an acre, it ends up actually, not only does it, it does take nitrogen out of the air, fix that through the rhizobium, but it also actually pulls a lot of nitrogen out of the soil too. So we actually don't see much of a credit with soybeans anymore, as we may have seen in the past. But definitely with corn or anything else where we have a lot of residue left over, wheat stubble, what might be another situation there, we will see some immobilization. And so that's why we often don't say there's a soybean credit, but there is definitely a crop penalty, a corn crop penalty, where we have to add a little more nitrogen to handle that. Mineralization is a great source of nitrogen, but the problem with mineralization is that it is driven by that soil temperature, that soil moisture, and by that pH. It's got to basically be perfectly right for that for the bacteria to work it out, and it may not occur when we really want to. You remember back on that crop uptake chart, a lot of the mineralization of the soil takes place a little bit later in the season, maybe about late vegetative, maybe in the early reproductive stage. But we really love to have that mineralization occur kind of about B6 to B9 or so. And when we planted corn later in the season, about late May and June, like our grandpas and great grandpas used to, they could take advantage of that. But since we have moved our planting season a lot earlier, getting as best as we can because we've got very good pole germs, great seed protection as well, we have to supplement with that nitrogen. So we don't get as much benefit out of that mineralization for the vegetative part of it, but definitely for the reproductive in a lot of cases. Okay. So speaking of mineralization, let's talk about manure, because there's a lot of mineralization that can take place with the manure. Manure is a tricky source of nitrogen, as many of you know. It's not as simple and straightforward as commercial nitrogen that says, hey, this is 82% nitrogen in these forms here. No, it's got both the inorganic and organic nitrogen forms. And when it's even inorganic, it can be both nitrate and ammonium. So it is a lot more variable than commercial and a lot more difficult to manage for more reasons than one. On the left-hand side is a chart from University of Minnesota breaking down the distribution for manure between its organic and inorganic forms. So the dark colored aspect, the part of the chart is the inorganic, and the lighter, I guess that would be gopher gold, I guess, is organic nitrogen. And so swine manure, typically what you see in a deep pit barn, it's going to be around 75%. I'd say it's actually probably closer to 80% in a lot of cases or more, and that is in the inorganic form. Again, ammonium typically, and the other balance will be the organic nitrogen. But if you get the dairy or beef, in those, say, slat barns or something like that, 50-50 organic and inorganic. Now, when we look at the solid side of things, though, and jump down to, we don't see that so much with swine, but dairy and beef, so think about your feedlots, think about your other barns with a lot of solid manures. Most of that's organic nitrogen. So about 90% is in the organic form, 10% is going to be inorganic. And poultry, a quarter of that's in the inorganic, 75%, give or take, is in the organic form. But I also I called out both the dairy and beef is because we feedlots and dairy farms, we do produce a lot of solid manure there, and a lot of it does get applied, of course, but a lot of that's in that organic form. And it does take a while for that nitrogen to break down. So this other chart on the right-hand side, this data from Nebraska, shows us about, give or take, 40% of that organic form of whatever you're applying may become available the first year. So if you have 40% of your 90% of your total amount, it's not as much as you think it's going to be available the first year, unfortunately. Now, layer manure with no bedding is going to be a little bit better, but composted feedlot manure is going to be way less, about 15%. So you might go out there and put on 20 tons, and each ton may have 10 pounds of nitrogen in it. And so you think 20 tons, oh, that's 200 pounds. Well, only 15% may be available the first year. So you're not going to see as big of a benefit. And a lot of that will become available year after year after later. And so this is on a yearly basis, not even to mention that 1 year. So that's what makes manure so tricky with nitrogen management is when does that organic nitrogen become available? It may become available when your crop doesn't need it, and then it's lost. So that's one of the challenges that we deal with manure management. Go on to the next slide. Cover crops is another interesting dynamic, and that's gained a lot of interest here in Iowa and a lot of the Midwest. It's a great tool to capture, to hold down erosion, to capture residual soil nitrogen, promote biology development, and how that cover crop works really does depend on what species that you've got there, the growth stage and the termination time, and really, those two together really do affect the plant available nitrogen release from those cover crops. This chart here really is super interesting. It shows what happens if you have just a legume cover crop or 75% legume grass, 25% legume balanced grass, or just a cereal like a rye or triticale or even wheat. And what it shows is that, and this is kind of generalized, but it shows that as you let the crop develop further, it can do different things depending on the species. In the case of the legume, it definitely develops more plant available nitrogen because it is pulling the nitrogen out of the air, fixing it in the plant, and you have probably like an 8-to-1 or 10-to-1, 12-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. But crops like rye or wheat, that's a little more tricky because they have their greatest nitrogen content in the plant, and therefore their lowest C to N ratio when they're at the very small stage, right? When they're maybe a foot tall or 6 inches tall coming out, they actually have the greatest nitrogen concentration they're going to have. But there's just not much of it. So if you terminate them at that point, you don't have much pulled out of much nitrogen pulled out. So if you let them go another week or so, they'll grow up to, maybe knee high or thigh high, and so they've got more nitrogen content. But the problem is it also becomes the C to N ratio also adjusts as well. So if you terminate it then, you spray Roundup or crimp them, they may release a little more nitrogen, but maybe not. Of course, when you get the head high, it may have maxed out its nitrogen concentration. They've actually lost some of it, and now the C to N ratio is even worse. It's going to take a lot longer to break down. And it's going to have a lot more competition with the crop that you're trying to grow there. So one could imagine with something like rye or wheat, there's a sweet spot where you get just enough growth to get a lot of that nitrogen out there, and you fill at the right time to be able to get the release at the right time. I think that window's got to be very narrow. I've done some research on that, did a few cuttings and measurements of cover crops years ago, and I think there is a sweet spot there, but it may not be exactly when you think it is and when you're ready. So that's always a challenge with cover crops and nitrogen release. One on the next slide, stabilizers is also, we need to discuss it when we're talking about nitrogen management. And there's really two types there, nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors. Nitrification inhibitors are just that. They slow down the nitrification rate. They suppress the bacteria that causes nitrification. Doesn't kill it off completely. It doesn't eradicate it from the soil, but maybe right around the zone of the application it does. And products like Nserve or Instinct or Centuro, and there's a few others on the market that do that, and they work, and they tend to do well. I did some research on those where we worked on some fall anhydrous application fields, some with and without those products, and took measurements from December to April, basically going out and drilling into those knife marks, and I could find out that those with the nitrification inhibitors did keep more of that nitrogen in the ammonium form than the others that did not have the nitrification inhibitors. They had already converted, even though they were applied right before the cool down the soil, as it was starting to get down to 35, 33 degrees, they still converted nitrate a little bit more. Now, again, it put nitrogen at risk, didn't mean it's lost, but it did mean that there was nitrification that did occur. So the products do work, it's just a matter of what happens after that. Urease inhibitors, they slow down the conversion of urea to NH4 positive, that ammonium ion. So Agritane is a commonly known product. NBPT is the chemical name for that. And that's a really great tool as well to slow down any kind of surface supplied or any loss or hydrolysis of surface supplied urea. And probably the way to think about this is their insurance policies. People say, well, gosh, do I really want to pay that $15 or $17 an acre for the nitrification inhibitor or the certain amount per ton for the urease inhibitor? but it's insurance. Sometimes it pays off, sometimes it does not. I think if you were going to apply urea and you saw the storm clouds on the western sky, okay, you might not need it. But if I'm going to go apply urea out there, it's going to be many days before we might get some rain. It's a good idea. Same thing with nitrification inhibitors, right? It may have a perfect year and be dry, and the conditions are good that we don't have any loss. But there may be that one year where it just rains and rains, and we get a lot of denitrification, or we get a lot of leaching, and we lose a lot of nitrogen that we may have been able to save if we had that inhibitor there. So some years it pays off, some years it doesn't, but in general, they tend to pay off more than not. Next slide is jumps into biologicals and really focusing on nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now, there's a lot of them that are coming on the market, and I think the results are still yet to be seen on some. There's a lot of hype about them, but the things I do want to talk about there is, number one, that process is kind of energy intensive. The process to be able to take nitrogen out of the air, fix it to the roots, and as NH4, basically convert from N2 to NH4 positive, and be able to take it up by the roots is an energy intensive process. The Haber-Bosch process that we use to make commercial anhydrous ammonia, that process takes up 2% of the world's energy production. I mean, so that in itself is an energy intensive. This is also in nature. So it's not a free ride. It's not there for nothing. It does take energy at the plant has to consume. And sometimes with the biologicals, we can have the right product. It may be working very well in certain fields or certain conditions, but it might be the wrong environment. They're living organisms that we put out there, and we maybe take them to the wrong environments or treat them improperly, like we had some chlorine in the water, or it's too hard, too cold. I was doing a little research this morning on nitrogen fixing bacteria, again, a very popular one that you'd probably be familiar with. And it was discussed that, where bacteria this type of bacteria tends to work very well, is a lot of times the same conditions where nitrification and mineralization also work quite well. When that soil's in its Goldilocks, it's like it's warm, it's moist, it's not too wet, not too dry. When do you really want to see the benefits of a DNF? When it's really wet or when it's really dry, when I've had some really bad conditions. But the bacteria may not be in this happy spot to do that. So that's always a consideration there as well. Now, universities have done multiple trials on this. Some work that was done led by Dave Franson at North Dakota State here a few years ago. They compiled a lot of on-farm trials and small plot trials. They found that across the board, doesn't matter which brand or which product it is, they didn't find a lot of benefit to these. 59 of the 61 site years didn't really show any yield increase with these bacteria products at the same nitrogen rates. So it doesn't have quite a great track record yet. Not to say it's terrible bad, but we need to put it in context that this is not going to supply all your nitrogen needs for corn generally. It may be supplemental at best, but there's always some caveats to that. So let's kind of wrap things up here. We're getting to the end of the hour here, but what are some of the best strategies for nitrogen management? Like I mentioned, I don't have the answer for your farm. I don't know how you farm. I don't know where you're at. It could be different, but I think these are questions that we can all ask ourselves, no matter where we're at, and to really help us understand what's our best practices. So, what's a reasonable expectation for the yield of our crop? If I live in, again, the sandhills of Nebraska and it's not irrigated, I probably won't have a really high yield goal and therefore don't need to put on 240 pounds of nitrogen. But I am in the conditions where I've got 5 or 6% organic matter and good drainage and likely a good weather. I might be able to grow a very good crop and might need that much, or might be able to have some good mineralization potentials too. And it's always aware of to know when that crop uptake is, when the mineralization may occur, and those lost pathways like we talked about. Knowing your soils and knowing what kind of water flowing conditions they have, how water flow through them, that's going to be super important to understanding what kind of fertilizers you can use, what your timing might be for those, if you need inhibitors or not, and just understanding when and how those nitrogen could be lost. Talking again with my local neighbors last week, we really dug into that. Denitrifications are a big problem here because we have a clay pan like that Luton silty clay I was talking about. It's basically about 2 feet down and sometimes closer to the surface. So it makes it really difficult. We have a lot of denitrification losses. And I think as you think about your nitrogen management program, you really have to be able to adjust for some in-season curveballs that may get thrown at you. Now, if you've got center pivot irrigation, you've got fertigation. you've got a great tool there to be able to handle in-season changes very easily. But if you're putting all your nitrogen up front, or even just early at planting, it's a challenge as well. And so we need to think about what are some things we can do to help ourselves out if there's a problem occurs, we get the weather that doesn't quite cooperate. What do we do there? And go to the next slide. So I just would ask all of you, how's your nitrogen program today? Are you satisfied with what's going on today? Do you have questions? Does it keep you up at night? Are there areas where you feel like you could be improved? And I think a big one is, are you reacting or are you being proactive? You know, we like to think, well, hey, I'd love to have just this program. I could put this on and do this every year. That would be great. But we know that nature is going to bat last. We know that the soil is a lousy place to store nitrogen. We know the crop needs nitrogen at certain times of year. So what can we do to make sure we have the right amount of nitrogen on at the right time, so that we get the best bang for a buck, get the best amount of our investment, and we're also taking care of the environment as well. One way to do this too is just think about on-farm trials, and doing some of your own work. And it's real easy nowadays with the variable rate capable equipment that a lot of folks have nowadays. And you can set them up pretty easy and do some post-season analysis. This is an example I'm actually working with one of my neighbors on. I mentioned manure. We have some hog barns in our area, and sometimes that manure can be quite variable. So this field did get hog manure applied to it last fall, basically the first week of October, right when the soybeans came off. They started putting hog manure on, and that was ripe conditions for a lot of nitrification loss. So it was told, this was stated, that they applied about 160 pounds of nitrogen, both in that organic and inorganic form. But typically, what this farmer does is comes back and puts on extra supplemental nitrogen, in this case, anhydrous ammonia. And so I told him, I said, you know what? Let's just have a little trial on your farm. It happens to be that his applicator, anhydrous applicator, is the same width as his corn head, both 16 row, give or take. And I said, let me just set up a trial for you that you can just apply with your applicator. It's going to be aligned with your rows. And we're going to put 4 nitrogen rates out there, 4 replications. I tried to get him to do a 0. He kind of balked at that. So we went 60 to 150 pounds. The 150 pounds on top of the 160 sounds a lot. 310 pounds, I get it. But we think that some of that's going to be lost. So we want to be able to see, where is that sweet spot when we harvested this fall. What was that sweet spot? What was the nitrogen rate where we maximized our return on investment, but that we didn't apply, use more than we need to, and we maximize our yield and return there. And these are kind of trials that you can do as well. But I just want you to think about, what is it that is keeping you up at night about nitrogen management there. What are ways that if there's a way to be able to predict or think about different scenarios, what would that look like? If there's a way to kind of see if there's some differences within the field that we can use to manage, that would also be great as well. This is not a sales pitch, right, necessarily for what we do at Sentinel, but those are things that we kind of lead into to say, these are opportunities where we can dial in a little bit better, have a little more insight into what's going on in the crop, not have to be guessing and galling about it, but really be able to take a proactive stance on nitrogen management. So this kind of wraps up what we talked about tonight. We talked about the basics of nitrogen management, nitrogen in general, just to give you a baseline of that. I'm sure a lot of you knew that already, but maybe there's some things you learned in that regard. Also, those manure cover crops, stabilizers, biologicals, there's a lot to those, a lot of dynamics that go into that. And it's good to call that out. And then I want to just leave you with some thought about, what are you doing in your operation? What can you do better? What are some insights you could be looking for as well? How can you be more proactive and not be reactive? Not only for your own bottom line of your operation, but also for the good of the environment, for your neighbors downstream as well. So that wraps it up for tonight. Go to the next slide. I've got my contact information, but if you check me out on Twitter, like I said, you'll probably see some other interesting stuff around nitrogen management, also maybe about goats and chickens and my kids as well. But I'd love to interact with you as well, and love to take some questions if you've got them as well. Jackson, do we have anything in the Q&A?
Right now, I don't see anything. I was just going to say the Q&A is open for anybody that wants to post. You can also raise your hand, and I can take you off mute if you'd like to ask that way. But would love to see any of your questions that you might have for Bob. Bob, one thing that I saw in the presentation I thought was kind of interesting is the mineralization versus pH curves. It's something I had not really taken too much of a look at, and soil temperature as well. Um, Seems to be a three-way interaction between pH, moisture, and temperature for mineralization. Are there any particular things that people can do to help predict what that mineralization might be like, or ways they can think about that going into the growing season?
Yeah, I believe that was nitrification was those three dynamics there. But mineralization also, has a lot of those same characteristics. Um, and so, yeah, just knowing that, with either one of them, as we get warmer soils, more moist soils, not too wet, not too dry, we're going to see a lot of that conversion from ammonium to nitrate. We're going to see a lot of potential mineralization of that soil as well. It might be a little bit of a lagging indicator with mineralization. It may occur a little bit later in the season, but definitely, if we have very warm conditions, we apply, like say, anhydrous ammonia into the soil. We're going to have probably, once in that 60, 70-degree soil temperature, you're going to see a pretty immediate conversion after a few days there. And again, if it's in that moist field capacity stage, it'll be probably converted pretty well. Now, again, if we're in that moist stage, once that field capacity, excuse me, that doesn't mean water can't move. It can move upwards into the soil. It can be drawn by the plant roots and through osmosis, a direction there. But it won't leach out necessarily until we get heavy rains or into that close to that saturated conditions.
Great. There's
Rob
so
asked,
many.
yeah, I said, Rob asked us, does the corn crop prefer different forms of nitrogen at different times during the growing season? That's a great question. I think, um, I, I've seen some research about that, corn typically, today's corn is bred to more looking for that the nitrate form. Um, and that's a lot of what's being supplied throughout the growing season. I guess I don't have as strong a deep insight into that. I'd like to know if somebody has somebody else has some thoughts on that. But it's a good question there.
Anthony, I think I took your mic off. You should be able to ask your question now.
Bob, this is Anthony, your former colleague at Corteva. Good to see
Yes.
you. Nice
Yes.
presentation. Yeah, we're talking about best strategy. Of course, there's this recommendation that the best strategy is site-specific nitrogen application with respect to variable rate application. But I was just looking at, from my little experience working with the farmer, I discovered that most people, they still apply uniform rates. So even with this knowledge, what is the adoption rate of, we all know it's a variable rate is the best, but what is the adoption rate, and what is hindering people from adopting, especially growers from adopting most of this best strategy approach that comes from research and research findings.
I think that adoption of variable rate nitrogen, if I remember correctly, is probably in the 20 to 30% range, give or take. The technology's there. I mean, every new applicator that comes out is pretty much available, capable of it. The question is why is it not being adopted? And I think there's a lot of uncertainty about it. Just even those first slides where I talk about that sweet spot may move around from year to year or location to location within a field. And so farmers may look at that and say, well, I don't care. Hey, no one's stopping me from putting on a lot more nitrogen. So, or enough, more than enough nitrogen. There's no penalty other than the extra cost, but that cost is less than the penalty if I had too little nitrogen. And so they go ahead and just say, I'm going to put on a flat rate. That's probably more than sufficient, but it's still within my budget. And that way I don't have to worry about it. Corn is a little more forgiving on nitrogen than other crops like sunflower or canola or wheat even, in that if you put on too much of those crops, you have lodging, you have diseases, a lot more issues than corn can handle extra nitrogen. So that's probably where we get away with it too easily with corn, and that's a lot more forgiving. But unfortunately, it's not forgiving to the environment when we put on too much and it gets lost.
Thank you for the answer.
Yes, sir.
Pablo, I've got you off mute here, or not necessarily off mute, but your microphone is enabled. Not quite hearing from Pablo yet. Thor, I've enabled your mic as well, so if you're able to unmute and ask your question, that would be great.
Yeah, elementary question here. Is the economic optimum nitrogen rate, is that a data point that the Sentinel program provides?
It's not quite that. We do develop a rate that that we think that is sufficient. It's not, but the economic optimum nitrate is really the outcome of being able to have a whole range of nitrogen rates. We're not doing that. Maybe Jackson, if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. While we do believe our recommendations should land us close to the economic optimum nitrogen rate, ideally right at the economic optimum nitrogen rate each year. It's not a data point that we're able to provide during the season. What I will say is that our approach with a canary and a reference plot allows us to see nitrogen response over 90 pounds of applied nitrogen in the field. And so while it's not a full nitrogen rate trial as Bob described it, it does allow us to begin to quantify where the crop stops responding to nitrogen and where the economics make the most sense in terms of your nitrogen rate or getting close to that EONR. So there is some information we are able to provide at the end of the season that will help to answer that question. Pablo, if you're able to come off mute, I see your hand is still up there. Not sure that Pablo is going to be able to come off mute for us. So I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A. Bob, I don't know if you have any last things that you'd like to add for the audience tonight before we wrap up.
Again, thank you very much for taking the time tonight to come out and watch this webinar. I appreciate the opportunity. I hope you learned something, gained something from this. Again, it's a very high level overview. We could probably go into each one of those topics very deeply and have a 1 hour session on each one of those. But it is important for us to know the dynamics around nitrogen management. It is as critical for us to, as corn growers or any kind of growers of feed and fuel and fiber, that we do understand the nitrogen process, that we are responsible users of that for both our economics and for the environment. This is a quick introduction, and we appreciate the opportunity to share it with you.
Thank you, Bob, for presenting tonight. Thank you all for joining us. The recording will be sent out after the webinar so that you can follow up and watch again if you'd like. Please feel free to reach out to Bob, to me, or to anybody on the Sentinel team with questions, and we would be happy to answer your questions about this presentation or about anything really related to nitrogen and nutrient management. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.